questions about the Great Western Schism or the Avignon Papacy? Another major aspect of culture and society at this time point is the Renaissance. Touched on that a little bit just a few minutes ago. With the revival of interest in Aristotle during scholasticism, so you have that part. You have the interest in Roman law that develops as well. As the study of law becomes important and encouraged in universities, there's other interest in the classical period as well. Largely, the Renaissance will begin in Italy and will spread elsewhere. What we see in the Renaissance is the development of the humanities. Specifically, we're talking about this interest in understanding human beings and human behavior. Specifically, Greek and Roman life. So there's an interest in art and sculpture, what we would call science, but it's not quite science at this point. There's a lot of things that are interesting people about human beings. And out of this interest, of course, is a concern of old texts, ancient texts, Greek and Roman texts, but eventually will also spawn an interest in the original texts of the Bible. A man named Petrarch, for example, one of the early people of the Renaissance, was very interested in Latin and Greek. So he collected hundreds of manuscripts from monasteries and episcopal archives to study. He copied the manuscripts into his time period, he was doing it by hand, and then would imitate the classical style in his own works. Petrarch, however, only predominantly knew Latin, so other people are doing something similar with Greek manuscripts from those ancient times as well. This interest in the sources will revive interest in the Greek language, will revive interest in the Greek language of the Bible, and will revive interest in going back to the Bible as a source for faith and practice. So the foundations are being laid here for the Reformation. Another example of the way the Renaissance is working in all of this and how it's showing up with the relationship with Christianity and culture is the work of Dante Alighieri. From Florence, but influenced by and shaped by the intellectual currents of Paris. So he's got some Italian, got some French influence there. He studied philosophy and theology, but is mostly known for his literary works. We talked about how in the year 1300 he had traveled and taken a pilgrimage to Rome. And as he goes, he's very disappointed in the consumerism of the time, especially in context of religious sphere. And so he begins to write against, becomes very disaffected by the papacy, to the point where he will be exiled in 1301 for his opposition to Pope Boniface VIII. His major work is known as the Divine Comedy. Now, this is the one that starts with a trip through hell. Not exactly the most humorous of material, so why Divine Comedy? Well, it's called that because of its happy ending. Because he will travel through hell, and then purgatory, and then into heaven. Literary. It is written in, instead of being written in Latin, as a lot of works were, it is written in the common language. So it is something that ordinary people could read. It is a poem. And as I said, this journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, beginning on Good Friday in the year 1300. Essentially, Dante takes the imagery of Revelation and applies it to the secular church. But it's not just important because of its critiques of Catholicism, the fact that he is writing against the papacy. It's also interesting because of the influence of classical thought on the work. He is guided through part of his journey by the Roman poet Virgil, and certainly not a Christian in any sense of the word. And so his guide, even though Dante's Christian, his guide is this Roman poet. And Dante really loved of Virgil's major works, the Aeneid, especially Aeneas' journey to the underworld. And so that's kind of an opportunity to honor his concern, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, his love for the poem by kind of replicating that a little bit in his own sense. Virgil guides his way for some of this journey. His love, Beatrice, and this woman that he had really been enthralled with, who ended up marrying somebody else, guides him on the way as well. And then finally he is guided by Bernard of Clairvaux in this trip. All these people, of course, dead. The pinnacle of the poem is a beatific vision of Mary, right? Seeing her in all of her glory in heaven. Essentially, the comedy, Divine Comedy, commented not only on theology and some of the existence of hell and purgatory, etc., but was also a commentary on a variety of subjects present in text. Throughout his travels, he encounters a variety of historical and mythological figures, many of them from Greek and Roman history. But he also sees, for example, Muhammad, the founder of Islam. He's in hell. There are other interactions between Dante and older popes. The older popes, however, suggest that both Boniface and then later Clement V are destined for hell as well. One of the major issues that shows up in this, especially in this context, is the prevalence of simony, the buying and selling of church offices. The poem, of course, is very symbolic. The number 3 and its multiples are found throughout. There's the 9 circles of hell, for example. Often a lot of what people think about hell we can see that is shaped by Dante's Inferno, the first part of this work. Sinners in hell suffer symbolic punishments. The gluttonous, for example, live on heaps of garbage. The flatterers have to spend their time in sewage. The sexually perverse are forced to walk on burning stretches of sand. At the very beginning of the descent into hell are the words, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." On the other hand, when you get to Paradiso, heaven, there are symbolic rewards as well. The center of the descent into hell, reaching the inner part, he views Satan. Satan is a huge, stupid beast frozen in a lake of ice. He has 3 heads and 3 mouths, and in his mouth he is chewing on Judas, Cassius, and Brutus, who are depicted as the worst of sinners because they are traitors. Now, while often we think of hell in terms of fire, of course, that shows up in places in Scripture, here Satan is trapped in ice in the center of hell. Well, the conception is that he is the farthest from the light and warmth of God, so that's why he would be in ice instead of fire. As I mentioned, the poem goes through a journey on through the circles of hell. The Inferno starts in the anteroom of people that were neutral, and so they're not quite the worst sinners, but they are kind of present in hell. Within the furthest circle are the virtuous pagans, and they're essentially in limbo and not as much in hell. They lived good lives, but they were pagans. The second circle, moving in, is the lascivious, people that had involved in sexual sins. Gluttons, the next circle, the greedy and wasteful, the wrathful, the heretical. Circle 7 is the violent, the fraudulent, and then the treacherous. Similar sins are found in the second part of the Divine Comedy, Purgatorio. And you see pride, envy, wrath, slothfulness, gluttonous, the 7 deadly sins. Finally, of course, there is the ascension into Paradiso. It too has several levels broken up into planets and other heavenly bodies. Those in the level of the moon are faithful, but they are inconstant. They are not consistent in their faith. Those in the realm of Mercury had their service marred by their ambition. Those in the level of Venus, the circle of Venus, had demonstrated love, but that love had been marred by lust. The level of the Sun are the theologians. The level of Mars are those who were courageous, just warriors. And then we move on into Jupiter, those that were great rulers. Saturn, those that had demonstrated great temperance. The mystics, the people that lived lives of contemplation. Then there was the church triumphant in stars. And then at the end of the universe was this moving realm, the primomobile. And this is where the angels are. This is the area that sets the rest of the universe in motion. And then there was the highest of heavens, where the angels, the saints, Mary, and the Trinity are viewed as well. Not only did the Renaissance bring an interest in classical literature and classical life, it also brought an interest in a critical approach to that literature. So as these people began investigating ancient texts, they began to become very interested in finding the most accurate version of the text. And as you compare manuscripts of these ancient texts, there would be some differences in wording, punctuation, etc. And so, how do we determine which is the right reading? And so you have interest in vocabulary, usage. It's not just thinking about these texts and thinking about what's the meaning behind the text, it's about the text itself. But this also meant that people discovered ideas in text that were actually fraudulent, but that had been previously held in high regard. Lorenzo Valla was one of those who discovered that some texts were false. He was a papal secretary who did not like scholasticism, did not like the religious orders or the Vulgate, thought it was inferior to the Greek text. He becomes influential in determining that a document that we've talked about before, the donation of Constantine, was actually a forgery. Now the document purported to give the Pope a lot of secular power, specifically in the region around Rome where he lived. Based on the vocabulary used, though, Valla was able to determine that the document could not have been written during the 4th century. It had to have been a much later document, essentially undercutting the basis for papal power. Also, at this time, Valla took a critical eye at the Apostles' Creed, which had supposedly come from the time of the Apostles. He too discovered through examination of language that that was not likely either. Now, it's not like Valla is interested in destroying Christianity. He's not an enemy of Christianity, but he is an example of how some of these methods could be detrimental to some deeply held beliefs. However, works like these, like Valla's work on the veneration of Constantine often didn't make an impact on people until subsequent generations. We're talking about a time period where there were low levels of literacy. So even if people could have access to these manuscripts, they didn't really read them. So primarily the people reading such documents, like what Valla is doing, is reserved primarily for the intellectual class. So those documents had rather low circulation. Valla will die, however, before a very important invention that might have been used to circulate works like his, the printing press, the movable type printing press. So we'll talk about here in a minute. Another important literary work of the time, coming from England, is Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Little is known of Chaucer's life. Apparently was a high-placed civil servant in England who spoke and wrote in French as well, and was well acquainted with the learning of the time. Canterbury Tales, of course, very important work in the English literature of the time period, but also had some very important religious components as well. Chaucer, of course, dies before the work is complete, but at the beginning he writes, "Now I beg all those that listen to this little treatise," the Canterbury Tales, who listen to it or read it, that if there be anything in it that pleases them, they thank our Lord Jesus Christ for it, from whom proceeds all understanding and goodness. So here too, it's important to recognize that while the Renaissance provided the foundation for people to critique Christianity, Catholicism especially, and will provide the foundation for later thinkers to distance themselves from Christianity, often these people did not see themselves as leaving Christianity. They did not see themselves as being unfaithful. They saw their work as fitting into a Christian worldview. Chaucer's plan was to tell the tale of 30 pilgrims traveling to the city of London to the shrine of Thomas a Becket. And as they traveled, they would tell each other tales about their lives or about other things. The goal was that each of the pilgrims would tell 2 tales on the way to London and 2 tales going back. Ultimately, he didn't finish before his death. It's actually less than half complete. And would include a retraction for writing about worldly vanities. There are several religious themes that show up in the Canterbury Tales. Many of the characters are religious. There's a monk and a priest, a prioress, who would have been a woman in charge of a female convent or monastery, a summoner, who is responsible for bringing people to an ecclesiastical court, friar, who would have been an official or a leader in a monastery. Some of these are presented in a positive light, others are not. One of the figures is a pardoner, who's related to indulgences in tennis. He's essentially presented as a charlatan who is hawking indulgences, and so he's just trying to exploit people. There are arguments in the work about the treatment of women being contrary to Christian theology, sexual relations as a good given by God, some of which would have challenged traditional theology at the time. It's also a work that believes in the corruption of the church. The pardoner is corrupt, he's fake. The summoner is guilty of the crimes or the sins he's dragging others before the ecclesiastical court for. But again, Chaucer is not trying to reject the religious life. Instead, he's saying it's become too corrupt, that religious life should be about simplicity and about devotion.